The first night Daniel finally slept through, a German Shepherd lay quietly across his trailer doorway, guarding the only place he still called home. Just days earlier, he didn't even know her. Daniel had returned from war to a silent trailer, a low-paying job, and nights he could never finish. Then one evening, on the same mountain road he drove every day, something felt wrong. The wind that always whistled through a narrow stone gap had stopped. When he stepped closer, he saw her, a trembling mother shielding 3 newborn puppies with her body. She wasn't trying to escape. She was holding the cold back. Daniel thought he was rescuing a dog, but that quiet moment would slowly bring him back from the war he carried inside. If you believe small moments can change a life, subscribe and stay with this story. Cold air rolled down the mountain ridge as dusk settled in. The narrow gravel road was nearly empty, and wind usually slipped through a familiar stone gap along the hillside. But tonight the sound felt different. The quiet seemed heavier, like something was missing. Daniel Brooks drove that road every evening after work, his old pickup rumbling gently as it climbed the final bend toward the small valley where he lived. He was 47, broad-shouldered but lean from years of manual labor, with weathered skin shaped by sun, wind, and long hours outdoors. His dark brown hair had begun to gray at the temples, and a short, uneven beard framed a jaw that always seemed slightly tense, even when he was calm. People in town described him as polite but distant, a man who nodded more than he spoke. Daniel hadn't always been that way. Years earlier, before the war, he had laughed easily and stayed too long in conversations. After returning, silence became easier. He worked long shifts unloading lumber at a small yard outside town, a low-paying job that covered fuel, groceries, and the aging trailer he called home. Routine helped him. Predictability helped him. Every sound along that mountain road had become part of that quiet structure he depended on. The wind through the stone gap always sounded the same, a thin, whistling note that rose and fell with the temperature. Daniel had driven past it hundreds of times, sometimes barely noticing, sometimes counting the seconds before it faded behind him. It was one of those small markers that anchored his day. But that evening, as he eased off the gas, something felt wrong. The gap that usually whistled into the cold air had fallen silent. Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. He didn't immediately understand why he noticed, only that he did. Years earlier, during patrols in unfamiliar terrain, he had learned to trust small changes, the absence of sound, the shift in wind, the weight of stillness. Those instincts had never left him. He rolled past the gap by a few yards, then slowed again. The truck idled softly. The mountain air pressed against the windows, and then he heard it. A faint, uneven sound, not quite a whine, not quite breathing, something in between. Daniel turned off the engine. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. He stepped out, boots crunching on frozen gravel, and listened again. The sound came from the stone gap itself, barely audible, as if something inside was struggling to draw air. He moved cautiously, not out of fear, but out of habit. His shoulders angled slightly forward, his gaze scanning the slope before settling on the narrow opening where wind usually cut through. When he reached the gap, he saw her. A German Shepherd lay across the opening, her body curled but rigid, ribs faintly visible beneath a dull black and tan coat. She looked around 4 or 5 years old, though exhaustion made her seem older. Her fur was matted with dirt and frost, and her ears, usually upright, drooped slightly from fatigue. Amber eyes lifted toward him, wary but not aggressive. Behind her, tucked into a shallow hollow in the earth, 3 tiny puppies pressed together, their eyes still closed, their bodies trembling as cold air brushed past the edges of the rock. The dog didn't move. She remained stretched across the opening, blocking the wind with her own body. The placement was deliberate. Daniel could see it instantly. She wasn't trapped. She had chosen that position. Her chest rose slowly, each breath shallow, and every few seconds she shifted slightly, adjusting herself to cover more of the hollow behind her. The puppies made faint squeaking sounds, nudging blindly against her side. Daniel stood still, absorbing the scene. He had seen injured animals before, stray dogs wandering roads, but this felt different. This wasn't panic. This wasn't fear. This was determination. The dog looked at him again, eyes heavy but alert, as if measuring whether he posed a threat. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, softening his posture. He had done that before with working dogs. Never staring too hard, never stepping too fast. "You're holding the wind back," he murmured quietly. The dog's ears twitched. She didn't growl, she didn't try to stand. She simply remained there, her body trembling, the cold pressing into her from both sides. Daniel crouched slowly. The air inside the gap felt colder, trapped and unmoving. He could see that the ground beneath the puppies was damp, and the dog's fur along her flank was stiff with frost. She had been there a long time, long enough for the earth beneath her to shape around her body. Daniel realized that if she moved, the wind would cut directly into the hollow. The puppies wouldn't last long. The realization settled quietly inside him. This wasn't an animal waiting for help. This was a mother holding on long enough to make sure her puppies survived. Daniel slipped off his canvas work jacket, the fabric worn but thick, and carefully laid it behind the puppies, using the rock edge to anchor it. The movement caused the dog to tense slightly, her head lifting. Daniel paused, letting her watch him. After a few seconds, she lowered her head again. It wasn't trust yet, but it wasn't rejection either. The puppies shifted into the warmth of the jacket almost immediately, their tiny bodies pressing into the fabric. The dog's breathing seemed to ease slightly, as if she understood the change. Daniel noticed then how thin she was. Her hips were sharp, and the muscles along her shoulders had tightened from strain. He wondered how long she had been without food. The wind outside the gap picked up again, brushing past his back. He remained crouched, feeling the cold seep through his jeans. Memories flickered unexpectedly. Another cold night years ago, waiting in silence, listening for danger that never showed itself but never left his mind. Daniel pushed the thought aside and focused on the dog. "You picked a hard spot," he said quietly. Her eyes remained on him, not pleading, not afraid, just steady. Daniel felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not urgency, not fear, purpose. It came quietly, the way the sound had first appeared. He glanced at the slope, calculating how he might move her without exposing the puppies. He didn't know yet what he would do, but he knew he wasn't leaving. The dog exhaled slowly, her head resting on the frozen dirt. The puppies nudged closer together, their tiny bodies now partly shielded by the jacket. The fading light painted the rocks in pale gray tones, and Daniel realized dusk had nearly passed. He would need to act soon. For a moment, neither moved. The mountain air settled around them. The silence returned, but now it felt different, less empty. Daniel adjusted his position slightly, careful not to disturb her. The dog blinked slowly, her eyes softening just a fraction. It had been years since Daniel felt needed. Years since anything depended on him in such a quiet, immediate way. Standing there, he realized this moment, small and silent, had already begun to change something inside him. He had only stopped because the wind sounded wrong, but now, with the cold deepening and the dog refusing to move, Daniel understood that this wasn't just a passing encounter. It was the beginning of something he hadn't expected, and for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel completely alone. Daniel remained crouched beside the narrow gap, the cold slowly working its way through his jeans, but he didn't move. The German Shepherd no longer looked at him with the same sharp caution as before. Her eyes stayed open, watching, but the tension had eased slightly. She understood now that he wasn't trying to take the puppies. He wasn't reaching for them. He was simply staying. The quiet stretched between them, not hostile, not friendly, but shared. The kind of quiet that forms when two living things accept each other's presence without fully trusting yet. One of the puppies shifted, letting out a faint, breathy sound. The mother immediately adjusted her body, pressing her flank more firmly against the hollow. The movement was slow but deliberate, and Daniel noticed the effort it cost her. Her shoulders trembled slightly as she repositioned herself. She was running on exhaustion. Even breathing seemed difficult. Daniel leaned forward just enough to see her front legs more clearly. That was when he noticed something new. Her right foreleg was angled awkwardly, partially pinned under a small slab of rock. Not crushed, but trapped enough that she couldn't move freely without exposing the puppies. "That's why you're not moving," Daniel murmured quietly. The dog's ears twitched at his voice. She didn't growl, she didn't pull away, she simply held her position. Daniel studied the rock more carefully. It wasn't heavy enough to cause severe injury, but combined with her exhaustion, it was enough to keep her anchored. She had likely shifted into that position and then realized she couldn't easily move again. Instead of fighting, she stayed. Protecting the puppies had become more important than freeing herself. Daniel exhaled slowly. You chose them first. The wind brushed lightly along the ridge, but the jacket now blocked most of it. The puppies pressed closer together, their small bodies steadier than before. The mother lowered her head again, conserving energy. Daniel rested his hand on the gravel, careful not to move too quickly. He could see now how thin she was, her ribs visible beneath the matted fur. She hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe longer. The sight pulled a memory from deeper than before. Rusty had done the same thing once. Not with puppies, but with Daniel. During a winter storm, when Daniel was 10, the heater in their small house had failed completely. Snow pressed against the windows, and cold air slipped through every crack. Rusty had climbed onto the bed and lay along the broken window frame, blocking the draft. He stayed there the entire night. Daniel remembered waking several times, seeing the dog still in the same position, eyes half open but alert. No one had told him to do it. He simply stayed until morning. Daniel blinked, returning to the present. The German Shepherd in front of him wasn't trained. She wasn't commanded. She was doing exactly the same thing, holding her position because something behind her needed protection. You're like him, Daniel said softly. The dog's eyes lifted slightly. Her breathing remained shallow, but she didn't look away. The distance between them felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally. Daniel shifted his weight carefully and leaned a little closer to the rock pinning her leg. He didn't touch it yet. He only studied the angle, calculating how much pressure he would need to move it. He knew sudden motion could frighten her. He would need her to understand. I'm going to help, he said quietly. The dog watched him, her gaze steady. One of the puppies nudged against her belly again, and she lowered her body instinctively. The movement caused her trapped leg to twitch slightly, and Daniel saw the strain in her muscles. She was holding herself still despite discomfort. That kind of restraint came from instinct, not training. Daniel shifted his hand slowly closer to the rock, then stopped, letting her see the movement. She stiffened slightly but didn't growl. Her ears angled forward. She was watching, deciding. Daniel waited. Seconds passed. The mountain air felt colder, but he didn't rush. Eventually, the tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. That's it, he murmured. He didn't move the rock yet, not until she fully accepted his presence. The puppies had grown quieter now, their breathing soft and rhythmic. The jacket held warmth inside the hollow. The mother's eyes drifted half-closed, though she remained alert. Daniel realized she trusted him enough to conserve energy, and that alone meant something. He stayed beside her, listening to the faint sounds of breathing. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. The mountain, the wind, the fading light, everything narrowed to this small space. Daniel noticed something else too. His mind had gone quiet. No sudden memories, no restless thoughts, just the moment. It had been a long time since that happened. The dog shifted slightly again, and this time she didn't tense when Daniel adjusted his position. The acceptance had grown, not full trust, but enough. Daniel glanced at the sky. Darkness was settling quickly. He knew he couldn't leave her here overnight. The temperature would drop further. The puppies wouldn't survive long. He made the decision quietly. I'm not leaving you here, he said. The dog blinked slowly. Her breathing remained shallow, but steady. Daniel leaned forward again, studying the rock that held her leg. He would need to free her carefully, then move the puppies. It wouldn't be easy, but he had already decided. He had stopped because the wind sounded wrong. Now he understood why. And for the first time in years, Daniel realized he wasn't just witnessing something fragile. He was becoming part of it. Daniel studied the slab again, measuring the angle with his eyes. The stone leaned against compacted dirt and smaller gravel, which meant lifting it carelessly could shift the entire edge of the hollow. He knew he needed leverage, not strength. Slowly, he rose and walked back toward the bend where his pickup waited. The air had grown colder, and the fading light turned the ridge into a muted gray silhouette. He moved quickly but carefully, aware that every minute mattered. His truck sat where he had left it, an aging blue Ford with rust along the wheel wells and a dull, scratched hood. In the back, a small metal toolbox rattled when he opened it. Inside lay a compact hand jack, its steel worn smooth from years of roadside use. Daniel grabbed it along with a pair of stiff work gloves and a short wooden block he kept for leveling uneven ground. The items felt familiar in his hands, practical tools from a life built around fixing things slowly rather than replacing them. He turned and headed back toward the gap. The German Shepherd hadn't moved. Her body still shielded the hollow, her breathing shallow but steady. When Daniel crouched again, she lifted her head slightly, eyes following the jack. He placed the wooden block carefully beside the stone, sliding it under the edge to stabilize the ground. Gravel shifted faintly, and the dog stiffened, but she didn't growl. Daniel paused, letting the movement settle. Before lifting, he reached slowly toward the puppies. The dog watched him closely, her ears angling forward. Daniel stopped halfway and waited. After a few seconds, the tension in her shoulders eased just enough. He gently scooped the first puppy into his palm, lifting it slowly and placing it into the fold of his jacket. The small body squirmed faintly, then settled into the warmth. He repeated the motion with the second, then the third, moving carefully each time. The mother remained still, her eyes fixed on his hands. With the puppies secured, Daniel positioned the jack against the wooden block. He turned the handle slowly. The metal creaked softly as pressure built. The slab shifted upward by a fraction, then held. Daniel paused, watching the dog. Her muscles tightened, but she stayed in place. He turned again, lifting the stone just enough to free the trapped leg. The dog didn't move immediately. She seemed unsure the pressure had gone. Daniel nodded gently. "You're free," he said quietly. She pulled her foreleg back slowly, testing the ground. Her paw touched the dirt, then lifted again. She shifted her weight cautiously, and Daniel saw the slight limp. It wasn't broken, just strained. He lowered the jack carefully and removed the wooden block, making sure the slab settled without sliding. The dog leaned forward, sniffing the jacket bundle. The puppies stirred faintly, and she exhaled softly, confirming they were safe. Daniel gathered the jacket, forming a cradle, and stood slowly. The dog hesitated, glancing back toward the hollow. The wind had begun to slip through again, carrying cold air into the space she had guarded. After a moment, she turned and followed him. They moved carefully down the short slope. Daniel kept the puppies close to his chest. The dog walked beside him, her gait uneven but steady. Every few steps she looked toward the bundle. Daniel spoke quietly without thinking. "They're okay, just a little farther." The truck came into view. Daniel opened the passenger door and spread the jacket across the seat. The puppies lay together, breathing softly. The dog hesitated at the door, sniffing the step, unsure of the enclosed space. Daniel stepped back, giving her room. After a moment, she climbed in slowly, curling around the puppies again. Daniel started the engine. The heater sputtered, then warmed gradually. He angled the vents toward the seat. Warm air filled the cab. The dog lowered her head beside the puppies, eyes half closed but alert. Daniel eased the truck onto the narrow road and began the descent. He found himself speaking again, quietly. "You held on long enough." The dog's ears flicked slightly. The road curved through shadowed trees. Daniel kept his speed slow. The presence beside him felt unfamiliar but steady. He noticed his breathing had slowed. The headlights traced the gravel ahead. Daniel glanced over once more. The dog remained curled protectively, her body forming a barrier against the cool air. The puppies shifted, then settled again. Daniel rested one hand lightly on the wheel. The drive felt different from the one up the mountain. Not empty, not silent, just quieter in a way that didn't press against him. He kept his eyes on the road, but he was aware of the steady breathing beside him, and as the truck rolled down the darkening ridge, Daniel realized he was no longer driving alone. The town lights appeared gradually as Daniel descended from the ridge, small and scattered against the dark hillside. The road widened slightly near the outskirts, and the steady hum of the engine filled the cab. Maggie remained curled around the puppies, her breathing quieter now, though still weak. Daniel kept one hand loosely on the wheel, the other resting near the heater controls, adjusting the warmth toward the passenger seat. He wasn't thinking far ahead, only focusing on the next step. There was only one place in town still likely to be open. Morgan Veterinary Clinic sat near the edge of the main street, a modest one-story building with aging white paint and a narrow porch. A single amber light glowed above the door, illuminating the gravel parking area. The rest of the street was mostly dark, storefronts closed, windows reflecting faint street lamp light. Daniel parked and stepped out. Cold air met him again, sharper now after the warmth inside the truck. He opened the passenger door slowly. Maggie lifted her head, watching him. "Easy," he murmured. He gathered the puppies inside the jacket and stepped back. Maggie climbed down carefully, favoring her leg but keeping her balance. They moved together toward the door. A small bell chimed when Daniel pushed it open, and warm air drifted outward. Inside, the clinic was softly lit. Shelves lined the wall with bottles and folded towels. A desk lamp glowed near the counter. Claire Morgan looked up from a ledger. She appeared to be in her early 40s, tall and slender, with chestnut brown hair tied loosely at the back of her neck. A few strands had escaped, framing a face marked by light freckles and calm, observant eyes. She wore a faded gray sweater under a white coat. Claire lived in the small apartment behind the clinic, often keeping late hours for emergencies. Years of working alone had given her a quiet, attentive manner. Her gaze moved from Daniel to the bundle in his arms, then to Maggie. "Bring her here," she said, already clearing the exam table. Daniel laid the jacket gently down. Maggie climbed up slowly, curling beside the puppies. Claire approached carefully, letting Maggie smell her hand first. The dog remained still, tired but alert. Claire listened to her breathing, checked her temperature, and examined the strained foreleg. "She's dehydrated," Claire said softly. "Cold exposure, too. The leg's strained but not broken." She glanced at the puppies. "They're very young. They'll need warmth and monitoring." Daniel nodded. "Can you treat her?" Claire hesitated slightly. "She'll need fluids and antibiotics tonight. Otherwise, she might not recover." She paused, not finishing the thought. Daniel understood. He pulled his wallet from his pocket. The leather had softened with years of use. He counted the bills slowly, then counted again. It wasn't much. He placed the money on the table. "Start with what she needs," he said quietly. "I'll manage the rest." Claire looked at the cash, then at Daniel's worn boots and damp jacket. His posture wasn't defensive, only resolved. She had seen that before, people who had already decided before asking. She pushed part of the money back toward him. "This covers supplies," she said. "I'll handle the rest." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I can pay later." "I know," Claire replied, "but tonight isn't about that." Daniel gave a small nod. Claire prepared the IV line and wrapped Maggie in warm blankets. The dog tensed briefly when the needle went in, but Daniel rested his hand near her shoulder. She relaxed again. The fluid bag hung above the table, dripping slowly. Claire placed the puppies on a heated pad beside Maggie. They stirred faintly, then settled. The room grew quiet except for the heater's soft hum. Daniel pulled a chair close and sat, elbows on his knees. Time passed. Claire wrote notes at the desk, occasionally checking Maggie. Daniel remained still. The warmth and quiet gradually weighed on him. His eyes grew heavy. He leaned back slightly, still watching the slow rise and fall of Maggie's breathing. Eventually, fatigue overcame him. His head tilted forward, his hands tightened unconsciously. The dream came quickly, flashes of movement, sudden cold, the sense of waiting for something unseen. Daniel jerked awake, breathing sharply. Something warm touched his hand. Maggie had lifted her head. Her nose rested gently against his fingers. She remained still, just breathing softly. Daniel's shoulders loosened. His breathing slowed. He rested his hand lightly against her neck. Across the room, Claire noticed the change. She had seen restless anxiety before, pacing and abrupt movements. This was different. The dog had responded quietly, without command. Claire leaned back, observing. Daniel's eyes closed again, this time more gradually. Maggie lowered her head beside the puppies. The lamp cast a warm glow across the small room. Outside, the night remained cold, but inside the clinic the air stayed steady. Neither Daniel nor Maggie moved for a long time. The quiet felt gentle, not heavy. Claire dimmed the overhead lights slightly, leaving only the desk lamp. And in the warm, steady light, both of them finally rested. Morning light slipped through the blinds of the small clinic in thin, pale lines, laying quiet bands across the floor and the exam table. The heater hummed steadily in the corner, and the room smelled faintly of antiseptic, clean blankets, and warm milk. Maggie lay curled around her puppies, still weak, but no longer trembling with cold. The IV line remained in place, and her breathing had grown deeper during the night. Claire moved quietly near the counter, writing notes in a chart, careful not to disturb the slow rhythm that had settled over the room. Daniel woke stiff in the chair beside the table, his neck sore from sleeping at an angle. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then he heard the heater, saw the warm light, and looked up. Maggie was awake. Her eyes were already on him. She did not look first at Claire, who stood only a few feet away, or even at the puppies pressed against her side. Her gaze went straight to Daniel, steady and quiet, as if she were confirming that the one who had stayed through the night was still there. Daniel blinked and leaned forward slightly. "Easy," he said, the word leaving him before he had thought about it. Maggie's ears shifted, and the tightness in her shoulders softened. She lowered her head again, not fully resting, but calmer than she had been a second before. Claire noticed the exchange immediately. She closed the chart and stepped closer to the table, watching the dog with the kind of attention that came from years of seeing small things matter. "That wasn't random," she said. Daniel glanced at her. "What?" "She looked for you first." Daniel looked back at Maggie, then shrugged as if the idea didn't belong to him. "Maybe she just heard me move." Claire gave a faint smile. "No. She checked the room, and then she checked for you." Daniel didn't answer. He rested his forearms on his knees and watched the puppies instead. One shifted clumsily, pressing closer to Maggie's belly. Maggie responded at once, angling her body just enough to shield it better. She was still a mother first. That made the moment Claire had pointed out feel even quieter and more significant. Daniel noticed it too, though he didn't say so. Later that morning, Claire removed the IV and changed Maggie's blanket. The dog tolerated her calmly, but each time Daniel stood and moved, her eyes followed him. When he stepped outside to wash his face at the small sink near the back hall, Maggie lifted her head and watched the doorway until he came back. Claire noticed again. "She waits for your footsteps now," she said. Daniel gave a small breath that was almost a laugh, though not quite. "That sounds like more than it is." "Maybe," Claire said, "and maybe not." Daniel left the clinic a little after noon, promising he would come back after his shift the next day. He drove to the lumber yard with dog hair still clinging to his jacket and the smell of antiseptic faint in the fabric. The yard sat at the edge of town beside a rail spur that hadn't seen regular service in years. By late afternoon, sawdust coated everything. The loading ramp, the pallets, the cuffs of Daniel's jeans. The work was steady and dull in the way he usually preferred, but that day he noticed something different in himself. More than once he glanced toward the road, as if checking the hour. More than once he caught himself thinking about whether Maggie's had eaten, whether the puppies had stayed warm, whether she had looked toward the door again. The next morning, when Daniel pushed open the clinic door, the bell above it gave the same soft chime. Maggie lifted her head before he had taken 2 steps inside. Claire was across the room sorting medicine trays, and she stopped long enough to glance from the dog to Daniel with quiet satisfaction. Daniel took the same chair beside the table. Maggie settled almost immediately. She did not wag her tail or struggle to rise. She simply looked at him, and the room seemed to ease around that fact. That became the pattern. Daniel would finish work, stop at the clinic, pull the same chair closer, and sit. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he didn't. When he did, the words were simple. He told Maggie about the weather, about the broken tailgate on his truck, about the lumberyard's old forklift that needed coaxing every morning before it would start. He didn't know why he spoke to her that way. He only knew it felt easier than speaking to most people. Maggie rarely reacted in obvious ways, but when he entered the room, she always looked at him. When he stood to leave, she always raised her head and followed him with her eyes. On the 3rd day, Claire brought him a paper cup of coffee and leaned lightly against the counter. "You know," she said, "most animals bond over food, routine, touch. With her, it's your presence." Daniel held the cup between both hands, letting the warmth settle into his fingers. Maybe she just remembers who carried the puppies. Claire tilted her head. That might be how it started. It's not why it's still happening. Daniel looked down at the floor for a moment, then back at Maggie. She was awake, watching him over the curve of her puppies. The feeling that passed through him was hard to name. It wasn't happiness exactly, not yet. It was closer to relief, but even that didn't fully fit. It was the strange, unfamiliar sense of being expected. Claire waited a moment before speaking again. "You had a dog once, didn't you?" Daniel glanced at her, surprised. "How do you know that?" "The way you talk to her," Claire said, "like you're remembering something." Daniel sat back in the chair, coffee cooling in his hands. For a few seconds he seemed unsure whether to answer. Then the words came quietly. "His name was Rusty." Claire said nothing, giving him room to continue. "He showed up when I was a kid," Daniel said. "Winter, skinny enough you could count his ribs. I figured he'd eat and leave. He didn't." A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth, small and brief. "We had this broken window in the bedroom. Every cold front found it. Rusty used to climb up and sleep right there, across the draft. He'd stay all night like it was his job." Claire looked toward Maggie. "And now she does the same thing in her own way." Daniel nodded once. "Yeah." But that wasn't the whole truth, and both of them knew it. Rusty had belonged to a time before war, before sleepless nights, before Daniel learned how easy it was to withdraw from the world and stay there. Speaking the dog's name aloud made that older version of himself feel briefly closer, not gone, just far away. The puppies grew stronger by small degrees. Their movements became more determined, their squeaks louder, their bodies rounder with regular feeding. Maggie watched over them constantly, but Daniel noticed that whenever he entered the room, she would lift her head first and then settle again, as if some part of her had been waiting to confirm his return before fully resting. It was such a small thing that another person might have missed it, but Daniel noticed. He noticed because he had spent years moving through rooms without anyone particularly looking up when he arrived. One evening he rose earlier than usual, knowing he needed sleep before the next shift. As he pushed the chair back, Maggie's head lifted. Her eyes stayed on him. Daniel paused with one hand on the back of the chair. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said quietly. Maggie kept watching. Daniel moved toward the door, and just before he stepped out, he glanced back. She was still looking at him, not because she needed food, not because she was afraid, because she had begun to expect him. Claire, standing near the counter, saw the way Daniel stopped in the doorway and looked back. She saw the shift in his face, too. Small, almost hidden, but real. He looked less like a man checking on an injured dog, and more like a man surprised to find himself included in something gentle. After he left, Claire dimmed the lights and finished her notes. Maggie curled more tightly around the puppies, but not before glancing once more toward the door. And somewhere between the sound of that bell each afternoon and the quiet lift of Maggie's head when he returned, Daniel began to understand what kept bringing him back. For the first time in years, he felt like someone was waiting for him. By the 5th day, Maggie had begun to move like a dog reclaiming strength instead of merely surviving. She still guarded her puppies, still checked every small sound they made, but her body no longer seemed held together only by stubbornness. She drank on her own, ate in small, careful portions, and stood more often beside the exam table, her weight distributed more evenly now that the strain in her foreleg had eased. Claire noticed the change first in the mornings. Maggie would finish eating, nose the edge of her blanket into place around the puppies, then turn toward the clinic door and stand there with quiet attention, ears lifted, as if listening for something beyond the room itself. Daniel noticed it too the next afternoon when he arrived after work. Sawdust still clung to his jeans, and the cold outside had left a faint redness across his knuckles. Maggie greeted him the way she had started to do each day now, lifting her head the moment the bell over the door chimed. Yet this time she did not settle once he sat down. Instead, she looked at him, then at the door, then back at him again. "She's asking for something," Claire said from the counter. Daniel glanced over. Claire was sorting gauze and medicine bottles into shallow trays, her sleeves pushed up, hair loosely pinned back. In daylight, she always seemed a little less clinical, and a little more like what she was beneath the white coat. A small-town woman who had chosen to stay where most people left, and who had built a life around patience rather than urgency. "You think she wants to go out?" he asked. Claire shook her head. "Not just out, somewhere." Maggie stood then, slow but sure, and faced the door. There was no anxiety in it, no pacing, no restless circling. It was intention. Daniel had seen that before in animals that remembered routes, routines, places that mattered. He looked at Maggie's posture, the set of her ears, the way she kept waiting without agitation. "The ridge," he said quietly. Claire nodded once. "That's what I think." Daniel looked toward the puppies. They had changed quickly over the last few days. Their bellies were rounder now, their little legs stronger, though still uncertain. One with a darker muzzle had begun crawling over the others whenever food came. Another, smaller than the rest, preferred warmth to effort, and tucked itself beneath Maggie's side whenever it could. Claire had moved them from the heated pad to a padded crate with folded blankets and a low warming lamp nearby. They were safe, fed, and watched. "I'm not taking them back up there," Daniel said. "You shouldn't," Claire replied. She set the tray down and came a little closer, lowering her voice out of instinct, though the puppies slept through everything now. "But I can keep them here another few days. She may need to see that place again before she can let go of it." Daniel looked at her. "You really think that matters to a dog?" Claire gave a small shrug. "Maybe not in the way it matters to us, but they remember. Smell, routine, shelter, people. Especially if the place meant safety." She paused. "Sometimes animals carry unfinished things too." Daniel let that settle. Maggie remained standing at the door, not pushing, not whining, just waiting. He recognized the posture because some part of him had worn it for years without knowing its name. An hour later, Daniel carried Maggie's old blanket to the truck, while Claire arranged the puppies more securely in the crate. She checked each one with practiced hands, touching bellies, adjusting the lamp, laying an extra folded towel along the side to block any draft from the back hallway. Before Daniel left, she handed him a small paper bag with cheese crackers, a thermos of coffee, and 2 sealed containers of soft dog food. "In case she needs a reason to stop," Claire said. Daniel took the bag and gave a short nod. "I appreciate it." Claire hesitated, then added, "Don't pull her anywhere. If she slows down, let her. If she stops, sit with her." "I will." Maggie climbed into the truck under her own power this time. She still favored the leg, but only slightly. The ride up the mountain felt different from the first one. Then, she had been weak enough to collapse into the seat. Now she sat upright for most of the drive, nose angled toward the windshield, taking in the air that slipped through the cracked vent. Daniel drove slowly, mindful of the rough shoulder and the fading afternoon light. He had left early enough that the ridge was still visible in muted winter gold when they reached the turnout near the stone gap. Maggie jumped down and stood still for several seconds. Daniel did the same. He had learned enough by now not to hurry her. Wind moved lightly through the pines, and the slope carried a mix of scents he could not separate. Maggie lifted her nose, then began walking, not toward the narrow hollow where he had first found her, but farther along the rock face and up a thin path that angled behind a stand of scrub cedar. Daniel followed a few steps back, careful on the shale. The trail curved along the mountainside and opened onto a shallow shelf, half hidden by stone and brush. It was not much to look at first glance, just a rough recess where the hillside dipped inward, but the longer Daniel looked, the more human traces emerged. A faded wool blanket lay folded twice over in the corner, stiff with weather, but once placed carefully. Beneath it sat a dented metal bowl with scratch marks at the bottom, and the faint ring of dried mineral deposits inside. 2 empty food cans had been tucked against the stone, not scattered. A length of frayed nylon rope lay coiled near the wall, not tied to anything, its wear marks telling Daniel it had been handled and reused, not used for restraint. This had not been a trap. It had been a makeshift shelter shaped by repetition. Maggie walked directly to the blanket and sat beside it. She did not paw at it or whine. She simply lowered her head once, inhaled, and then looked out over the slope below as though this had once been the direction from which someone appeared. Daniel crouched beside the bowl and ran his thumb along the rim. Someone had fed her here more than once. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but regularly enough for the place to hold pattern instead of accident. "So, you weren't out here alone from the start," he said quietly. Maggie remained seated, gaze fixed on the trees. Daniel sat on a flat stone a few feet away and let the place speak without forcing it into meaning too quickly. Someone had cared for her, maybe not with stability, maybe not with much, but with enough consistency for her to remember. The blanket had been folded by hand. The cans had been left in one place. The bowl had not rolled there by chance. Whoever had come here had tried, in whatever limited way they could, to make life hold together on the edge of the mountain. What struck Daniel most was not tragedy, but fragility. A place could feel like belonging and still disappear. A routine could be real and still break. Sometimes that happened through cruelty. Sometimes it happened because life came apart faster than loyalty could keep up. Maggie kept watch for a while longer. Then gradually her body changed. The alertness in her shoulders eased. She was no longer waiting in the sharp, held way she had carried when they arrived. She was remembering. That was different. Daniel could see it even without fully understanding how. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked out over the ridge. The air was cool, but the quiet no longer pressed on him. Beside the blanket, Maggie no longer looked like a dog holding herself ready for someone to return. She looked like a dog letting a place become part of the past. For a long while, neither of them spoke or moved much. When Daniel finally stood, he stepped closer to the recess and looked once more at the bowl, the cans, the folded blanket. "You had something here," he said. "Maybe not much, but it mattered." Maggie rose and came to stand beside him. Not behind him, not ahead of him, beside him. Daniel looked down at her, then toward the trail. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go back to your pups." This time, Maggie followed him down the path without turning around. By the time Daniel and Maggie reached the clinic again, evening had already begun to settle over town. The last of the mountain light had thinned into a cold gray wash above the rooftops, and the parking lot behind Claire's building held the stillness that came just before a hard night's freeze. Maggie climbed down from the truck on her own and stood beside Daniel without that searching tension she had carried on the way up the ridge. Claire was waiting at the back entrance with the door already open, a wool scarf looped loosely around her neck, and her hands tucked into the pockets of her canvas jacket. One look at Maggie was enough for her to understand the trip had done what it needed to do. "She's lighter," Claire said softly. Daniel glanced at Maggie. "Yeah, I think she is." Inside, the puppies were awake and squirming in their crate, small bodies stronger now than they had been only days earlier. Their squeaks were louder, their hunger more demanding, their legs just sturdy enough to push clumsily against one another when Maggie approached. Claire gave them a quick check before stepping back. "They're stable," she said. "Warm, feeding well, no sign of fading. If you're taking them tonight, I want you to keep them off the floor, out of drafts, and close enough to her that she doesn't get unsettled." Daniel nodded. "I can do that." Claire gathered what he would need with the efficiency of someone who had packed emergency supplies more times than she could count. She handed him a plastic storage bin lined with folded towels, a second stack of blankets, 2 shallow bowls, and a small canister of puppy formula with instructions written in dark blue pen across the lid. "Only if one of them falls behind," she said. "Most likely she'll manage on her own. But if one gets weak, don't wait." Daniel took the supplies, setting them carefully near the door. "I'll bring everything back." "I know," Claire said. Then, after a brief pause, "You don't have to sound guilty every time someone helps you." Daniel almost smiled at that, though the expression was brief. Claire noticed and let it pass. Before he carried the crate out, she looked directly at him. "She's ready to leave because she trusts where you're taking her," she said. "That matters. Don't make the space perfect. Just make it steady." The trailer sat at the far end of the gravel lane, narrow and weathered, but sound enough to hold warmth once the heater had been running for an hour. Daniel unlocked the door, stepped inside first, and moved quickly through the small space, clearing a patch beside the bed and away from the draft near the sink. The trailer carried the plain, worn order of a man who owned little but took care of what he had. A pair of work boots sat neatly by the wall. A metal lunch pail rested beneath the table. The bed was made with military corners out of habit rather than need. He laid down the thickest blanket first, then the bin lined with towels, then another folded layer around the sides to keep warmth in. When he returned to the truck, Maggie was already standing close to the crate, watching the puppies. Daniel carried them inside and set the bin into place. Maggie followed immediately. She circled once, sniffed the blankets, then lowered herself beside them with the kind of care only an exhausted mother could still summon. The puppies pushed toward her without hesitation. Daniel placed a bowl of water near the wall, adjusted the electric heater, and stood back for a moment, taking in the scene. The trailer felt smaller than ever, but it no longer felt empty. The first hour passed in a quiet sort of work. Daniel folded extra towels, warmed water on the tiny stove, checked the heater twice, and moved the lamp on the counter so its light fell softer across the room. Maggie remained focused on the puppies, but every time Daniel crossed the trailer, her eyes tracked him briefly before settling again. There was no anxiety in it now, just awareness. As the dark thickened outside and the thin walls began to tick with cold, the little space filled with the soft sounds of nursing, shifting blankets, and the occasional scrape of Daniel's chair. He had not planned to sleep much that night, but fatigue settled over him all the same. Near midnight, he turned off the lamp and lay down fully clothed on the bed, one arm across his chest, boots still on the floor within reach. Maggie stayed near the puppies for a while, then rose and moved toward the door. She lay across the narrow strip of floor between the entrance and the rest of the trailer, head on her paws, body stretched lengthwise as if she were measuring herself against every place cold might enter. Daniel watched her in the dim orange glow of the heater. Rusty had done that. Not exactly there, not exactly the same, but close enough that the memory came back before Daniel had room to stop it. A winter draft, a thin room, a dog choosing the cold side of the night so someone else could stay warm. He stared at Maggie's silhouette for a long time before closing his eyes. When sleep came, it did not stay gentle. The dream rose hard and fast, noise without shape, the feeling of impact before the mind understood what had happened, the sharp pulse of fear arriving before thought. Daniel woke with his breathing uneven and one hand half curled into the blanket. The trailer was dark except for the heater's glow. For one disoriented second, he listened for danger that was not there. Then he saw Maggie. She had lifted her head at the sound of him waking. She did not get up. She simply remained where she was, stretched across the door, steady and solid, exactly where she had chosen to be. Behind her, the puppies shifted softly in their sleep. Daniel let out a slow breath. He did not need to speak to calm himself. The sight of her there was enough. The old panic did not vanish, but it lost its grip more quickly than usual, dissolving into the ordinary details of the room, the heater, the towels, the low breathing of living things close by. He lay back again. The quiet no longer felt like an open field he had to cross alone. It felt held. Morning broke pale and brittle over the gravel lane. Daniel woke to the sound of a truck door slamming somewhere nearby, and the faint cry of one of the puppies. Maggie had already returned to the bin and was curled around them. He pulled on his jacket, stepped outside with a mug of leftover coffee, and found Harold Benson standing across the lane in his usual green flannel, one hand wrapped around a dented metal cup. Harold was a man the years had narrowed without softening. He had the bent shoulders of someone who had spent decades under engines and the rough, deliberate movements of a body that now argued with the cold. His white hair never quite flattened in the back, and his patchy beard gave him the look of a man who stopped caring what mirrors thought years ago. But his eyes were kind, and he noticed more than he commented on. "Heard puppies," Harold said. Daniel nodded once. "Yeah." Harold looked toward the trailer door, then back at Daniel. "Cold week for that." He took a slow sip from his cup. "I got an old wool blanket from my wife's cedar chest. Too heavy for my place. Better use over there." He lifted his chin toward Daniel's trailer. "You don't have to do that." Harold shrugged. "Didn't say I had to." An hour later, the blanket appeared, folded and clean, smelling faintly of cedar and old wood. Daniel tucked it beneath the bin for extra insulation. Not long after that, Lila Turner stopped by with a plastic grocery sack looped over one wrist. She was in her early 50s, medium height, with cropped dark hair streaked at the temples and warm brown skin weathered lightly by years of early shifts and backdoor deliveries at the market. Lila had a way of speaking that felt practical first and kind second, which somehow made the kindness land harder. "Canned food," she said, "and an old dish towel. Puppies always make a mess." Daniel accepted the bag. "Thank you." She glanced past him into the trailer and smiled when she saw Maggie watching from inside. "Good dog," she said simply, then left before the moment could turn formal. By noon, the lane had quietly done what small communities sometimes do without planning it. A folded towel showed up on the step. Someone left a bag of dry kibble by the door. A woman from 2 trailers down sent over a hot casserole dish with a note that only said, "Eat something." No one made a scene of it. No one asked too many questions. They just helped in the measured, practical ways people often did when they knew too well what it felt like to have too little. Daniel stood in the center of the trailer that afternoon, turning slowly with a dish towel in one hand, and realized the room no longer felt like a place built only for getting through the night. There was the bin lined with blankets. There was Maggie watching him from beside the puppies. There was food on the table that hadn't all come from his own grocery shelf. The heater ticked. Someone laughed faintly from outside. Harold's radio crackled across the lane. Something was changing, not all at once, not enough to frighten it away by naming it too quickly, but enough that when evening came again and Maggie stretched herself near the door, Daniel no longer saw only a dog keeping watch. He saw the outline of a life-making room for more than one heartbeat. And for the first time in years, the silence inside his trailer no longer felt like something waiting to break him. It felt like a place where warmth could stay. The morning Maggie followed Daniel to work for the first time, the air carried a steady cold, but no storm. Frost clung to the edges of the gravel lane, and the town moved slowly into the day. Daniel stepped out of the trailer expecting Maggie to remain inside with the puppies, but she rose immediately and walked to the door before he reached the handle. Her movement was calm and purposeful, not anxious. The puppies shifted but did not cry. They had grown stronger, sleeping longer, depending on her less with each passing day. Daniel paused. "You're coming with me?" Maggie stood quietly, ears forward. He opened the door wider. "All right, but you stay near the truck." The lumberyard smelled of pine dust and diesel. Maggie stepped down and settled beside the front tire, watching Daniel unload straps and check the forklift chain. Workers noticed her quickly, but she did not wander. She simply lay there, still and observant. Raymond Cole stepped out of the office, clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He was broad through the shoulders with a thick gray mustache and the relaxed posture of a man who had spent decades around noise and heavy machinery. He studied Maggie for a moment. "That's a steady dog," he said. Daniel nodded. "She'll stay put." Raymond gave a short, approving nod. "Good. Yard's safer when dogs don't think they're supervisors." He paused. "Town already heard about the pups." Daniel glanced at him. "That fast?" Raymond shrugged. Nothing moves quicker than good news in a small place. By midday, Maggie had shifted only once, moving into a patch of sun. A few workers passed. One offered a quiet greeting. Another dropped a piece of biscuit near her. She accepted nothing until Daniel returned. The discipline in that choice did not go unnoticed. Daniel found himself answering small questions during break. How old were the pups? Where had he found her? Were they keeping them? The conversation felt ordinary, and that ordinariness mattered more than he expected. The routine continued over the next few days. Maggie rode with him, waited near the truck, and followed him back in the evening. People in town began to recognize her. Someone waved at her from the gas station. Harold bent slower each morning, but still checked for her. Lila left a small bag of scraps by the trailer door twice that week. Inside the trailer, the puppies began exploring. Their legs were stronger now, their movements less uncertain. One tripped over Daniel's boot and barked at it. Another dragged a towel halfway across the floor. Maggie watched them with quiet patience. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed one night, unable to sleep. The heater hummed steadily. The puppies had settled, but his mind kept moving. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Maggie rose and walked to him. She rested her head gently on his leg. The contact was simple, steady, without urgency. Daniel lowered his hand to her neck. The tension in his shoulders loosened slowly. He leaned back against the wall, still touching her. Minutes passed. His breathing evened. Sleep arrived without struggle. When he woke, the heater still glowed and Maggie had not moved. He realized he had slept longer than he had in months. No sudden wake, no racing thoughts, just rest. The next morning, one of the puppies caught his attention. Smaller than the others, with a rusty-colored patch above its eye, it kept pushing forward only to tumble sideways. Daniel lifted it gently. "You don't give up, do you?" The name came quietly. Rusty. The puppy squeaked softly. Daniel smiled without realizing it. The memory followed immediately. Another small dog. Another cold room. Another time before everything had become complicated. Rusty had once slept across a broken draft. This new Rusty climbed across a blanket without knowing why the name mattered. Maggie watched the interaction, calm and observant. Days passed. Maggie continued to accompany Daniel. The puppies grew stronger. Rusty moved first toward everything. Another stayed near Maggie. A third preferred Daniel's boots. The trailer filled with small movements. Daniel began laughing at things he would once have ignored. A puppy sliding across the blanket. Maggie nudging one back into place. Harold trying to crouch and failing halfway before giving up with a grunt. The change came quietly but clearly. One evening, Daniel sat outside the trailer while Maggie lay beside him. The sky darkened early, and the lane settled into familiar stillness. Inside, the puppies shifted and squeaked softly. Daniel rested his hands on his knees. Maggie had followed him to work. She had helped him sleep. The puppies filled the trailer with life. Rusty had returned as a memory and a name. Daniel realized he was no longer just getting through the days. He was living inside them again. He looked down at Maggie. "You didn't just save them," he said softly. Maggie's ears flicked once. Daniel leaned back, watching the faint line of light across the gravel. The past was still there, but it no longer filled every space. Something new had grown beside it, quietly, without forcing him to choose. And for the first time, Daniel did not resist that change. The call came 3 days after Daniel had begun settling into the rhythm of taking Maggie to work. The morning had passed quietly, and he was tightening a loose chain on the forklift when a dark county pickup rolled slowly into the yard. Maggie, lying beside the truck, lifted her head before the engine cut. She did not bark. She simply watched, alert and composed. The man who stepped out moved with deliberate efficiency. Thomas Keller, Tom, as he introduced himself, was tall and narrow-shouldered, his posture straight in the way of someone accustomed to carrying weight for long distances. His beard was trimmed close along a sharp jawline, and his eyes scanned the yard before settling on Daniel. A faded rescue patch marked his jacket, and his boots carried dried mud from higher elevations. "You Daniel?" he asked. Daniel nodded. Tom glanced at Maggie. "Heard you've been up along the North Ridge. Folks said the dog found someone recently." Daniel shrugged slightly. "We helped." Tom folded his arms. "We've got a missing hiker. Probably took the wrong split. Team's gathering now. I was told you know those paths." Daniel looked towards the hills beyond the yard. The decision did not take long. "I can go." Raymond leaned from the office door. "Take the afternoon. We'll cover here." Within an hour, they reached the trailhead. 2 other volunteers waited there. One of them stepped forward to greet Daniel. Her name was Sarah Whitaker. She was tall, slender, with silver hair cut short around her jaw. Her face carried soft lines shaped more by patience than age. Years earlier, she had worked as a counselor, and the calm in her voice still reflected that training. After her husband disappeared during a winter fishing accident, she had joined search and rescue, not out of urgency, but out of quiet determination. "This the dog?" she asked. Daniel nodded. Sarah studied Maggie. "Good. Calm dogs hear more than nervous ones." They moved up the ridge in a loose formation. Maggie walked slightly ahead, adjusting her pace to the terrain. The path narrowed between rock and scrub. Wind moved across the slope, carrying faint echoes. Tom signaled when they reached the fork. "Most hikers take the left," he said. "Right side's rough." Maggie paused, nose lifted. She stepped right. Daniel followed. "This way." They moved carefully. Loose shale shifted beneath their boots. A faint sound reached them after several minutes, a voice thin and uncertain. Maggie stopped and looked downslope. The missing hiker sat against a rock, ankle twisted, relief clear across his face. Tom exhaled. Well done. They helped the man back slowly. The descent took time, but the work felt steady. Daniel found himself scanning terrain automatically, noticing small changes in the ground. The focus felt familiar, like a skill returning. At the trailhead, Tom nodded toward Daniel. You free next week? Maybe. We could use someone like you. Sarah added, You move like you're listening to the ground. Daniel did not answer immediately. Maggie sat beside him, calm. All right, he said finally. The next search came 2 days later. Then another the following week. None were dramatic. Lost hikers, a missing trail runner, a precautionary sweep after a storm. But Daniel began to learn the team's rhythm. Maggie became part of it naturally. She stayed quiet, attentive, adjusting to signals and movement. Volunteers started watching her reactions. Word spread quickly. When Daniel returned to town, people asked about the searches. Harold listened closely, nodding. Lila brought an extra thermos. Raymond asked which ridge they covered. Small improvements appeared around the trailer. A new wooden step replaced the uneven concrete block. A brighter porch light was mounted beside the door. Someone tightened the loose railing. The changes were simple but steady. Daniel stood outside one evening, studying the new step. Maggie lay beside him. The puppies, older now, moved confidently inside. Rusty chased another pup across the blanket. Tom's truck rolled past slowly, and he lifted a hand. Daniel returned the gesture without hesitation. Later that week, the team ran a longer search along the upper ridge. The wind cut sharper there. Maggie stayed close, occasionally pausing to listen. Daniel found himself moving with confidence, scanning slopes, noting safe paths. Tom watched him once and gave a short nod. You've done this before, Tom said. Daniel considered that. Something like it. When the search ended, Sarah handed Daniel a small radio. Keep it. Easier if we can reach you. Daniel took it, surprised. You sure? You're part of the team now. He clipped it to his belt. The weight felt small but meaningful. That evening, Daniel returned to the trailer tired but steady. Maggie settled beside him. The porch light cast a clear circle on the gravel. The town moved quietly. Radio music, distant conversation, a door closing. Daniel realized something had shifted again. He was no longer just returning to routine. He had responsibility. People expected him to show up. The mountains no longer represented distance from the world. They had become part of his place within it. He looked down at Maggie. Looks like we've got work now. Maggie's tail tapped once against the step. Daniel leaned back slightly, listening to the quiet around him. The trailer, the town, the ridge, all of it felt connected. The isolation that had once defined his days had been replaced by something steadier, and for the first time in years, Daniel did not feel like a man passing through life. He felt like someone needed to be there. The decision about the puppies arrived gradually, not in a single moment, but in the way Daniel noticed the trailer growing smaller each day. Their legs had strengthened, their play louder, their movements more confident. They chased one another across the worn floor, slid against the old couch, and sometimes bumped into Maggie, who watched them with patient calm. Daniel sat quietly, understanding that the space that had begun to feel stable would not hold all of them forever. The town had already begun asking. People stopped him outside the yard, outside the diner, even near the supply store. They spoke gently, not pressing, only wondering if the puppies might need homes. The first puppy left on a gray morning. He was the quietest of the three, a pale sandy color with soft eyes and careful steps. Lila had mentioned her sister lived outside town on a small property where the days moved slowly. Daniel drove there with Maggie in the passenger seat and the puppy wrapped in a folded blanket. Lila's sister, Margaret, greeted him at the gate. She was in her late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair tied loosely behind her neck. Her skin carried the pale tone of someone who spent more time outdoors than inside. Her hands were rough from gardening, but her voice remained gentle. She crouched slowly and allowed the puppy to approach. He rested against her knee within seconds. Daniel noticed Maggie watching calmly. When he left, she did not resist. She simply turned back toward the truck. The second puppy left 3 days later. This one moved differently, always first to explore, first to climb onto Daniel's boots. Tom mentioned a neighbor looking for a companion for long walks. The man, Caleb Morgan, lived near the lower ridge. He was broad-shouldered, in his mid-30s, with sun-darkened skin and thick brown hair that curled slightly at the edges. His beard was uneven, trimmed without much care. He spoke quietly, but when the puppy reached him, his expression softened immediately. The puppy jumped forward, tail moving fast. Caleb laughed once, surprised, then held the leash carefully. Daniel nodded. Maggie stood beside him, calm as before. When they drove away, the trailer felt noticeably quieter. Daniel kept the last puppy. He named him Rusty. The name came from memory rather than thought. Rusty, the dog from his childhood, had once slept near a broken window during a harsh winter, blocking the wind that entered the small house. Daniel had never forgotten that quiet act. Now the new Rusty followed Maggie everywhere, clumsy but determined. He stepped where she stepped, stopped when she stopped, and curled beside her whenever she rested. Maggie accepted him without resistance, occasionally nudging him aside when he moved too close, but otherwise allowing him near. Days settled into a steady rhythm. Daniel continued joining the rescue team. Maggie traveled with him, moving confidently along ridges and narrow paths. Rusty remained behind, too young to follow, though he waited near the window when Daniel left. When the truck returned, Rusty bounded forward, paws sliding on the worn floor. Maggie entered calmly, and Rusty circled her before settling beside her. The trailer remained simple, but warmth filled it differently now. A blanket covered the couch. A metal bowl rested near the door. Rusty dragged it sometimes, producing a hollow sound that echoed softly. Maggie lifted her head each time, watching him without irritation. Daniel found himself smiling at the small noise. One evening, Daniel returned from a short search along the ridge. The sky faded slowly behind the trees. Maggie settled near the doorway, her body angled outward. Rusty pressed against her side. Daniel sat on the wooden step, resting his hands on his knees. The day had been uneventful, but the quiet felt complete. He watched Rusty adjust closer to Maggie, and Maggie lower her head slightly in response. He realized the space no longer felt temporary. It felt lived in. Later that night, Daniel woke briefly. Rusty shifted, then settled again. Maggie remained near the door. Daniel listened, then closed his eyes without tension. The calm held. Morning arrived softly. Rusty slipped slightly on the step as he followed Daniel outside. Maggie moved slower, scanning the surroundings. Daniel filled their bowls and leaned against the doorframe. The routine required no thought. It unfolded naturally. Tom stopped by that afternoon. He leaned against his truck while Maggie watched from the ground. Rusty approached carefully, sniffed Tom's boot, then retreated behind Maggie. Tom smiled faintly. "He'll grow into it." Daniel nodded. "He's learning." They stood quietly for a moment. No urgency, no instruction, just presence. As evening returned, Maggie took her position near the door again. Rusty curled beside her, smaller but steady. Daniel sat outside while the porch light cast a soft circle across the gravel. The town moved quietly in the distance. Nothing dramatic happened, but Daniel understood something clearly. Life had not improved through sudden change. It had improved through staying. Maggie stayed. Rusty stayed. The town stayed. And Daniel, without noticing the exact moment, had stayed too. He looked at them once more. Maggie lifted her head slightly. Rusty shifted closer to her. Daniel stepped inside. The trailer felt small but complete. The past no longer filled the space. The present did. For the first time in many years, Daniel did not feel like he was waiting for something to end. He felt like he had finally come home. In the end, this story was never only about a rescued dog or a lonely veteran. It was about how healing often begins with responsibility. Maggie didn't just survive the cold. She protected her puppies. Daniel didn't just help. He chose to stay. The town didn't just watch. They stepped forward. Each small decision created a chain of kindness that slowly rebuilt a broken life. That is the quiet value of this story. Love grows when someone decides to walk away. Community forms when people notice pain and move closer instead of turning aside. And hope returns when even one living soul chooses to trust again. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive in dramatic ways, but many of God's miracles look like this: a wounded animal, a second chance, a stranger who helps, a door that finally feels like home. Perhaps God doesn't always change our circumstances instantly. Perhaps He sends something small, knowing that compassion will do the rest. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us where you're watching from, and consider subscribing to follow more stories of faith, healing, and second chances. Leave a comment so we can pray for you. May God bless your home, bring peace to your family, and remind you that even the smallest act of kindness, done with love, can become the miracle someone else has been waiting for.